Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. I'm here with the gentleman from the Duran, and there's a couple of contradictory things Trump has said recently about Russia. And the first one, he started off by, U.S. refuses to blame Russia for Ukraine war, splitting with their European allies in the UN votes. In a dramatic shift in transatlantic relations under President Donald Trump, the United States split with its European allies by refusing to blame Russia for its invasion of Ukraine in votes on 3 UN resolutions Monday seeking an end to the 3-year war. The growing divide follows Trump's decision to open direct negotiations with Russia on ending the war, dismaying Ukraine and its European supporters by excluding them from the preliminary talks last week. In a UN General Assembly, the U.S. joined Russia in voting against a European-backed Ukrainian resolution that calls out Moscow's aggression and demands an immediate withdrawal of Russian troops. The U.S. then abstained from voting on its own competing resolution after Europeans, led by France, succeeded in amending it to make clear Russia was the aggressor. The voting was taking place on the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion, and as Trump was hosting French President Emmanuel Macron in Washington, and his wife or father, who knows? Who knows who that is, really? I don't know who that is. But I get that's an amazing thing. I mean, what a shift in administrations from Biden administration to the Trump administration. And what do you make of Europe still trying to prolong this? What is in it for Europe to try to still make enemies with Russia? Wouldn't it be better for Europe all the way around if they fixed the Nord Stream pipeline and made friends with Russia? I don't get it.
You're absolutely right. You're applying logic to what Europe should do. European leaders, not European people, the public in Europe is becoming increasingly disenchanted with this whole thing. But European leaders are deeply committed to the war. And the reason they're deeply committed to the war is because they associate it with the United States presence in Europe. They want to preserve the US presence in Europe. They want to preserve NATO. They want to preserve all the structures that originate and have been created around NATO. Because, of course, if those go, then, of course, they have no place because other political forces will then step in and replace them. So that is why the European leaders are taking this extraordinary stance of basically attaching themselves to Zelensky, who's, not waving but drowning, as that poem says. They're attaching themselves. They're pulling themselves down. They're creating a deep and deepening crisis in Europe, but they don't seem to be able to change direction or change course.
It seems like a suicide mission for Europe, right, Alex?
Yeah, it is. But, for the European people, for the European elite, like Alexander says, for them, the most important thing is to keep the United States in Europe. It's not even so much about the Ukraine war anymore for the European elite, the globalist political class. For them, the Ukraine war is the mechanism that keeps the United States invested in Europe. It keeps NATO funded. Keeps NATO going, it keeps the weapons moving, it keeps the United States bogged down and investing and sending money to Europe, which is effectively the money that goes to all of the European institutions and all of the European elite. So that's why Ukraine is so important for them, because if Ukraine goes, then they see it as America goes, and if America goes, well, then there goes all of the money and all of the power as well, because countries like Estonia, like Latvia, even like the UK, they love to go around the world and to bully other countries and say, you better do as we tell you to do, not because we're this big, powerful country, but because we got the United States in back of us. And if you don't do what we tell you to do, well, then the United States is going to come along and they're going to sanction you or they're going to punish you. So it's the money, it's the power. They don't want to see that go. And the mechanism to keep the United States invested is Ukraine.
So so when they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, correct me if I'm wrong, that isn't Germany, which is the economic engine of Europe, aren't they paying like 2 or 3 or 4 times as much for energy now as they were before that? And hasn't that had a ripple effect across every economy in Europe?
Absolutely. The whole of the European Union is in deep crisis. Germany has had 3 years of economic contraction. Nobody calls it recession, by the way, even though that is what it is. But we avoid calling it a recession. We just call it now an economic contraction. So that's now the new language that's being used. But everywhere, right across Europe, you have economic recession, you have stagnation, you have falling wages, you have growing problems. And that's why you see all these political movements, some of which I have sympathies for, some of which I don't, by the way, coming up to the fore, because they're at least trying, or at least expressing, some of the frustrations that the European public has with the European elite, which, exactly as Alex said, is completely tied up with the whole concept of the West, which makes them feel important, which gives them status in the world, which gives them status in their own countries, and which ultimately, it's important to remember, is the world they know. I mean, they've lived inside it. It's very frightening, very disturbing for them that it might change. So that's the reality. Nord Stream, far less important, much more important. Keep the Americans in, keep them committed to Ukraine. And if, somebody blew up Nord Stream, well, don't talk about it very much. Engage in investigations which go nowhere. Talk about the Russians all the time. Say it was the Russians who switched off the gas supply, which European leaders are doing, by the way, all the time. Olaf Scholz is doing it. Ursula von der Leyen is doing it. Keir Starmer in Britain has recently taken to doing it. So talk in that way, rather than face realities, or really face the problems of the people of Europe.
So so now we just showed you that Trump's UN ambassador would refuse to vote with Europe to say that Russia was at fault for the invasion of Ukraine in 3 different votes, 3 different ways. But here's the thing that seems a little puzzling to me. Trump extends Russia sanctions ahead of meeting with Zelensky. I mean, in the early 1960s, this would have been called diplomacy, but in these dumbed down reactionary times, they refer to it now as playing both sides, because, you can't sell weapons unless you have a side. Is that about him wanting to just put money in the pocket of the military industrial complex as he winds down the war?
Well, I think probably one of the reason that he would have given, if you asked him for why he did it, is because he didn't want to lift the sanctions just before Zelensky came, because that might have appeared as if he really was tilting towards Russia. And of course, if you've listened to what he said in all his exchanges with Zelensky, he's trying to insist that he's taking a sort of middle position. But ultimately, again, you're absolutely right. He wants normalization of relations with Russia. It makes absolutely no sense looking at that, that you keep the sanctions. It disincentivizes the Russians to seek normalization with the Americans, because the Americans are still sanctioning them. But logic and reason has been thrown out of the window for such a long time now that perhaps one shouldn't expect it just to come back at all quickly. At least we should be grateful that the Americans and the Russians are talking, and not to worry perhaps about things like sanctions, which the Russians themselves now understand are not going to be lifted anytime soon.
Well, just to let you know exactly what is happening, U.S. President Trump signed a decree extending some of anti-Russia sanctions until March 6, 2026, ahead of his meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The decree, which is set to be published in the U.S. Federal Register on Friday, extends the 10-year-old state of emergency over the situation in Ukraine. The sanctions were first declared on March 6, 2014, under Barack Obama in response to the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea joining Russia. The decree also extends related sanctions imposed by Obama. Trump was about to meet the Ukrainian leader, for whom he said has a lot of respect after recently calling him a dictator. He has said his Friday's meeting with the Ukrainian president has in store a potential $1 trillion deal, offering the U.S. easy access to a bonanza of rare earth minerals. We'll be digging, Trump told reporters on the eve of Zelensky's visit. The American taxpayers will now effectively be reimbursed for the money and hundreds of billions of dollars poured into helping Ukraine defend itself. So, we're the masters. The United States are the masters of traumatizing an area to the point where they would give you anything to make it stop. Sort of like a Guantanamo torture tactic. That's kind of what is happening here. This is at odds with the widespread assessment of current and former U.S. officials who say there's little actual evidence of great rare earth and other mineral wealth in Ukraine. They say much of what does exist will be difficult, even impossible, to exploit in the eastern war-torn part of the country. On February 12th, Trump said negotiations to end the Ukraine war will start immediately after holding a lengthy and high-productive call with Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. And here, Michael Tracy tweets out, Trump suggests he's going to get the Black Sea coastline back for Ukraine. Presumably, this would require Putin agreeing to relinquish territory that he's declared an eternal part of the Russian Federation. Let's listen.
Mr. President, are there areas specifically of Ukraine that you're talking about in giving back, specifically Crimea? Have you gotten to those details yet on such an agreement?
Well, you mean the areas that were taken?
Yeah.
There are a lot of areas that were taken. Yeah, we've talked about it. A lot of the sea line has been taken, and we'll be talking about that, and we're going to see if we can get it back or get a lot of it back for Ukraine, if that's possible. We'll be seeing about that. Okay? Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Press.
Thank you very much.
So, what do you think? Do you think he's going to be able to get back that territory? What is the plan there, you think? Alex?
No, he's not going to be able to get back that territory. I think Russia's been very clear that not only, at least in the terms that they've outlined in June of this year, Putin outlined these terms, that it's not only about the territory that they currently hold, but they consider the entirety of the region, Zaporozhye and Kherson, Lugansk and Donetsk, as part of the Russian Federation. That means that any Ukrainian presence that is currently in those regions would have to leave in order to get to a point where Russia's ready to negotiate. So that's Russia's opening bid. That's their minimum for negotiations and for terms. So Trump is not going to be. I mean, I don't see any way that he's going to be able to get the territory back, especially on the Black Sea. I mean, the whole rare earth minerals deal. We've been talking about this in a few videos that we've made, me and Alexander, and then the whole thing seems like smoke and mirrors. I mean, there's no $1 trillion rare earth minerals in Ukraine. Most of the minerals are in the Russian part anyway. About 50%, maybe up to 70% of the rare earth minerals are in the Russian part of what they hold right now currently. So, this whole $1 trillion in minerals doesn't exist. There is oil and gas in this deal, Jimmy. So the deal, which is about a 2-page memorandum of understanding, I don't even think you can call it a contract or a deal. It's pretty much written on a napkin paper. I mean, that's how flimsy this agreement is. And it basically it's Zelensky giving 50% of his country's resources in perpetuity to the United States. But there's nothing really holding this deal together. The money goes in some fund. The United States gets access to oil and gas and ports and minerals and whatever. And that was this big deal that was going to be signed today. And that's what Trump is talking about as he's sitting there with Keir Starmer yesterday. And he's talking about getting this contract and perhaps having some leverage over Russia as they go into negotiations. That's what I think this is all about. And
this is on top of Ukraine selling off half of its farmland to BlackRock, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're balkanizing.
It's selling of their country. It's the selling of their country. And the deal is, I mean, Alexander, he knows these things better than I do, but I've seen a lot of MOUs and a lot of memorandums of understanding and term papers, term sheets. I mean, this deal is not even that.
No.
It's 2 pages of nothing.
And
But-
go ahead, Alexander.
No, it describes it exactly. I mean, I have seen deals about minerals extractions and things of that. This isn't even a point of agreement. I mean, it's something that somebody wrote out very quickly without really exploring the details. They're not even a list of assets that are going to be extracted or developed or anything of that kind. I think this thing began to acquire at some level a kind of symbolic importance. I think Zelensky came along, talked about he's got all of these minerals, which he doesn't really have, to the Americans months ago, saying, you know, you give me weapons, go on giving me weapons, and I will give you all of these minerals. And somehow or other, through some strange process, we got into a situation where the Americans began to take that seriously and started to demand these mineral rights and all of these other rights. And the thing got its own momentum somehow, and it turned into a kind of test of wills between the Trump people and Zelensky, that, you know, you've got to sign this thing and you must sign this thing. If you don't sign this thing, this will be very, very angry with you. So they've now come up with a warm of words, which is actually completely meaningless because there really isn't anything to trade.
Well, just to put a button on this, Clandestine tweets out, there's a lot to unpack from Zelensky's debacle at the White House today, but my initial takeaway is that Trump just got the optics he needed to go scorched earth on Zelensky. Trump might not help Ukraine at all now, and Russia's end of the deal probably just got sweeter. Now Trump can be more lenient with Russia in negotiations, and Zelensky has solidified himself as an irrelevant speed bump on the journey to peace. Zelensky just lost his most valuable asset, which was Trump's diplomacy. Now Trump might not give Ukraine anything. It looks bad for Ukraine. Like, how much are the Ukraine people going to regret that they didn't sign that peace deal in March of 2022? I mean, that was the time, and they had it already worked out and agreed to, and then Zelensky just folded like a house of cards when Boris Johnson went there and said, don't sign the peace deal. Now, I'm sure he was getting threats from the Nazis in his own country to not do that. But, I mean, that was the best. I mean, it's unbelievably sad, actually, to see what happened to the Ukrainian people and to Ukraine because someone like Zelensky just went along with the West, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the April 2022 deal was a very good deal for Ukraine. The person who negotiated it on Zelensky's behalf has said so. The Russians made surprising concessions at the time. And I think the mood in Ukraine increasingly is that they must have negotiations. And I think that an awful lot of people in Ukraine, those that know about this deal, like, you know, one doesn't know how many people do know about it because the media space there is very controlled. But I think quite a lot of people do. They already bitterly regret that opportunity for peace, for a settlement, for a long-term settlement with Russia was not taken up. That agreement in April 2022 committed Russia to supporting Ukraine's EU bid. I mean, it went that far.
No kidding. I didn't know that. Which was a big part of why we couped their government in 2014 because we wanted Ukraine to be more aligned with the EU instead of getting a sweeter deal from Putin. That is amazing. I didn't know that. Wow. Absolutely.
I mean, the Russians said, no NATO, you can't be in NATO, you can't have any military alliances, you've got to reduce the size of your armed forces. You're not required to recognize Crimea or the Donbas republics as Russian or as independent as they were then. But, you can have security guarantees from the Western powers. We too will give you a security guarantee, only they won't cover Crimea and Donbas, where we will continue to be. So not even formal recognition of those territories. And yes, if you want to join the EU, we accept that's an economic association. It's your sovereign right, and we will back you. That was what the deal said. It was unbelievably favorable to Ukraine. And it was terrible, a disastrous mistake that they walked away.
And not to pat myself too hard on the back here, but it was an easy call when this war started in 2022 that this is exactly how it was going to end. It was going to end, as we said here, exactly how Russia wants it to end. However Russia wants it to end, that's how it's going to end, and that is exactly how it's ending right now. And the losers, all those people in the United States on Twitter, I don't go on any other social media with their stupid Ukraine flags in their profile bios, and they have no idea. The American people have no idea how propagandized they are. You were propagandized to hate Russia in the first place. You were propagandized to think Putin was a worse thug than American presidents, even though as we light the whole Middle East on fire and kill millions of people, Putin didn't do that. We did that, and we continue to. We occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. I could go on, and it's just is the propaganda as bad in Europe as it is in the United States?
It's worse. I mean,
Very
it really
bad.
is. It's very, very bad. I mean, in the United States, there is. You will find discordant voices. You'll find them. You'll find people like yourself. You'll find them on social media. There's much more. Europe basically doesn't have its own social media. The only social media that exists in Europe is the American social media. So there aren't the same platforms for people to speak, limited and difficult as they are. And the media is absolutely monolithic on this. You won't find any kind of diversity or argument about this at all. And of course, the BBC is relentless on this. In Germany, the media is as well. So the level of propaganda in Europe is just off the scale. I think it's worse than in America.
Really? Wow.
Keep in mind that a lot of the media in Europe, Jimmy, is or was funded by USAID.
Yeah.
Yeah. So things might change going forward. It'll take time, but we might see some changes. But USAID played a big role in the media operations in Europe.
Well, they certainly funded that Vox Media Ukraine, which put a hit piece after hit piece on me, trying to get me demonetized. It worked. They got Jackson Hinkle and some other people, but for whatever reason, I managed to survive that. That was my own tax dollars being paid to propagandize, advertising people against my own company. So I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that. Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.